A ghost story is being so commonly discussed about town that we shall not be accused of peddling horrors if we relate it for the benefit of the few to whom it may yet be news. The ghost is none of your phosphorescent females wrapped in the cerements of the tomb. It is a male specter with his boots on who takes a lively interest in the railroad business. His haunts are about the Cargill elevator and the general vicinity of the old depot grounds. No doubt, when anything goes wrong in the yard, it was the ghost. Several men have been killed by railroad cars in that vicinity, and one of them evidently doesn't know that he is discharged and keeps right on about his business the same as ever.
The railroad industry was a vitally important component of any community in the 19th to mid-20th century, both for freight and passenger travel. Before this time, steamboat travel was the only other viable option, but in winter, this traffic shut down. The first railroad to reach La Crosse was the La Crosse and Milwaukee line, which later became the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, also known as the Milwaukee Road. Winter bridges allowed train travel to cross the river when it was frozen, connecting Minnesota to La Crosse markets. But businesses and political leaders in La Crosse wanted to entice other lines to come into the city, to encourage competition and keep consumer fares and freight costs reasonable. All the rail lines came in from the north side of La Crosse, and the railroad bridge that spanned the Mississippi was finally completed in 1876 and was also located north of La Crosse. But by 1885, La Crosse boasted 5 railroad lines that came into the city, so we were less dependent on steamboat traffic or any one railroad by that time. So the railroad boys that are mentioned in the articles would have been doing things like coupling railroad cars together with pins. They would have been working probably late at night, all night long, trying to join the trains together, loading other products to get to market. Railroad work was very dangerous, especially at this time. There were few safety measures compared to today. Engines squealed as they backed up on the rails, but there was no sound signal to let people or the workers know in the vicinity that a train was moving or backing up. Lanterns at night would cast off ambient lighting, so there wouldn't be a whole lot of task lighting. It would be scant overhead lighting, probably in the rail yard. No one was wearing any visible safety vests, and LED flashlights, of course, had not yet been invented.
The large area of land just northeast of where the Mississippi Black and La Crosse rivers meet has sat unimproved for decades. It was most recently the site of Mobil Oil. Years of environmental mitigation of the land and raising it out of the floodplain has led to the current redevelopment as the River Point District. In the 1880s, this area along the Black River was a link connecting rail traffic to river traffic. Cargill, the largest privately owned company in the United States, had its historic roots in La Crosse. While there is no longer any connection to La Crosse, the company had a grain elevator strategically located right on the riverfront in the vicinity of the Milwaukee Road rail yard with access to the train tracks. It has long since been torn down.
So we are down here on the pedestrian bridge just right off of Riverside Park going over the La Crosse River. The north end of that bridge is the oldest and most well-documented haunted area in the city of La Crosse. The story of its hauntings go all the way back to 1882. In 1882, there's a large railroad yard on the south end of the bridge, and once you crossed it, it fanned out into another large railroad yard. So in 1882, the La Crosse newspaper, the La Crosse Chronicle, runs several articles of strange things being seen down here. The first article appears on November 17th. And journalism back then was a little bit more flowery, but the article starts out essentially saying, everyone in town is talking about this, but we are printing this up in case somebody missed it. And then they went on to describe all the strange things people had been seeing down here. So there was a brakeman who was coupling cars in this yard late at night, and he had this big heavy steel pin in his hand, and that's what he used to couple the cars together. So he's about ready to put that in place into the last car of a string of 9. Before he could do that, he told the La Crosse Chronicle that an invisible hand overtook his, pulling that heavy pin from his hand and then disappearing. He said he didn't drop it, he didn't accidentally throw it, the pin was just gone. And the engine pulls away, he discovers all the pins he had just put in place. were now missing. In that same article, they shared a story of an engineer who was moving along one of the lines, and he said suddenly there was someone on the tracks, a complete stranger. Couldn't identify him. He lays on the bell, he's shouting at him, the firemen's yelling at him, brakemen's screaming at him. They throw on the brakes, but it's too late, and he crumples under the wheels of the engine. They said they could hear bones crunching. Well, they all get out of the engine, they go look to see, where this victim was lying, and their actual quote was, "We didn't find hide nor hair of this guy," so absolutely nothing. So that's November 17th. And then the next day, the paper runs another story. And they tell of an engineer who was in his cab late at night. He said suddenly it got sharply colder, and then a mist drifted in behind him. He then heard a voice say, "We need an engine and 2 cars to take us up, up, The paper said the last one came out between a shriek and a groan. That's the 18th. No article on the 19th. November 20th, the paper runs another story, and this article was pretty much saying, "Please stop coming down here." The citizens of La Crosse were really curious after those first 2 articles, and by the 20th, they are coming down here in large numbers, everyone hoping to catch a glimpse of the railway ghost.
The articles in the paper drew a lot of interest to the rail yard where the ghost was supposedly to be found. The night after the initial article in November 1882, hundreds of people went out to the rail yard in hopes of seeing the ghost. One of the people drawn to the rail yard after the original article was Samuel Staller from Minnesota. He was a railroad brakeman himself, and it sounds like he was skulking around the rail yard and the Cargill elevator drunk, pretending to be the ghost. Another newspaper in town, probably upset that they had been scooped on this ghost story, reported Staller as the cause of all the things attributed to the ghost. This paper claimed everything else was just stories made up by the rail yard workers.
2 years later, 1884, another newspaper, the La Crosse Republican Leader, runs their story of strange things being seen down here. They wrote of people seeing a shimmering, floating specter that creeped along the iron rails late at night, whose clothing would appear and disappear as if the night winds had held them in their keeping.
Journalistic integrity seemed to be missing when it came to reporting about the railway ghost, and with multiple papers competing for readers all the time, you can imagine stories about the ghost were covered in various ways. The original 1882 articles were published by the La Crosse Chronicle. A few days later, the La Crosse Republican and Leader wrote a pretty scathing editorial discrediting the Chronicle for reporting stories about the ghost as fact. Then in 1884, the roles were reversed. The Republican and Leader reported on the railway ghost with new incidents that were treated as factual. The Chronicle took the opportunity to call out the Republican and Leader for a rehashing of its own articles from 1882, and even tried to claim its original reporting about the ghost was just a joke. Republican and Leader fired back, saying the ghost was a new ghost, and that this time, probably because they were the ones breathlessly reporting on it, it was real.
It's hard to say, which came first, the chicken or the egg. The ghost would be seen, but there were a lot of accidents back then. But it seems like there would be, there would be appearance of the ghost, and then there would be an accident right after that. There was reports of a railroad worker who wasn't particularly pleasant in life, and he carried on that way after death. And they believe that is the ghost down here. Some people believed it was the victims of the War Eagle steamer that had caught fire and sank right here, right off this property. So many people believed it was those two that were the culprits.